parents' businesses after the war, and at the same time as trying to remain loyal to their parents and their family, had to go to school and, see the films that were mandatory to watch in German schools of what was found in the camps and all the piles of bodies that were found in the camps after the war. And you can imagine the confusion and the complete sense of bewilderment. What were they supposed to do with their feelings? So some of them, some of them are welcome this work. Others don't welcome it or even reject it and claim that it's false. And no matter what I come up with, it's false. And there's nothing I can do about that. Today I must say that I don't think it's right to reject facts and to reject the realities of history. But I think I can have some sympathy with the dilemma that generation found itself in. And then when it comes to my generation, I found that when I first printed up the first version of The Pendulum, which was actually half of the current book. So I was out already speaking about this story and thought it might be a good idea to have some copies of the book with me, or a book with me. So I wrote a shorter version than what has just recently been published. And my cousins all wanted to have a copy of this because they wanted to try to understand why they had poor relations with their parents. Or at least some of them had poor relations with their parents, not all of them. And so for them, it was, as I explained to you earlier with my Paraguayan cousins, there were other cousins as well. It was a sort of freeing and hopefully will open up an opportunity for better communication with our parents before they're gone.
Thank you for sharing this whole story. And to wrap up, I'd like to ask a really big question that you hinted at earlier. And that is, it's lazy and kind of simplistic to think there were good people and there were evil people. And we can look at the world in this, sepia-toned World War I type of memory where it's brave American GIs storming the beaches of Normandy. And that's it. Those are the good people, and the bad people were mustache-twirling Nazis. And this question, what came to my mind of how do you not completely write off ancestors who did terrible things? Can you find ways to redeem goodness in them, even though their actions were attributed to something terrible? And what came to my mind is the argument in the United States about Confederate war memorials, where those in the communities would say, well, we're not celebrating slavery, we're celebrating the chivalry and the patriotism of these people. And then critics would say, well, no, the war was fought for the purpose of slavery. So whether you like it or not, that's what's being celebrated. It's a thorny question, and I don't know if I'd have a clear answer, but did you come away with anything along those lines?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I think that on the one hand, we have to continue to make progress on human rights. This is very important from so many different points of view. If we don't try to pursue a direction that is constantly increasing our humanity, we also won't be able to get along with each other and deal with very serious problems that humans are confronting now, such as climate change and our environmental problems. So I think it's extremely important that, for you took the example of the Confederate statues. I mean, I think it's extremely important that we acknowledge the realities of what that war was fought over, and that perhaps the best place for those statues isn't wherever. Maybe we shouldn't destroy them, but we should perhaps think a bit more about what their significance is by today's standards of human rights. Then back to the issue of how we see people. Like my grandfather, for example, who were very committed to their cause, who really believed in what they were doing, and hurt an awful lot of people, and by some people would be labeled as evil. Well, I think I want to give you a little story to answer the question, because I think it sums things up quite nicely. at some point in my research, I thought I need to find out about my grandfather's early life, because I don't believe people become this way for no reason at all. I think there are a lot of factors that come into play in a person's life that cause them to make certain decisions and cause them to, fall into an extremist movement in this case. And some of those can be very personal and very individual, and some are more common and responding to, overall events in the society which are better known. So I found my grandfather's birth certificate buried in an archive in the city of Hamburg, and in the left column of that birth certificate, the midwife who had delivered him had scribbled quite an extensive story in handwriting, in which she explained that the mother of this child had given birth to him in her area of Hamburg, which is a poor industrial area of Hamburg, and had left the child there. So she wasn't able to care for it and left the child with this midwife who looked after him for the first 4 years of his life. And it turns out that the reason that she had left him was because she was from, the upper middle class, and the father of the child was from a lower class. And in the extremely hierarchical society of Wilhelmine Germany, their marriage wasn't condoned, and this child was regarded as a bastard. Now, if you were an illegitimate child in that society, quite a few doors were closed to you. And it isn't really difficult to imagine that somebody born with this label at that time in history, so my grandfather was born in 1905, might have responded very positively to a movement that said, we're going to have a new elite, and you can easily become part of it. Just join. You'll be on the top of the pile. Right? Things like that, these are not things that are incomprehensible or impossible to understand. We have to go into the individual human stories, and that's why this history is never going to get old, because there are so many individual human stories that haven't been told and are unknown. And that's one of the reasons I went very deeply into both of my grandparents' stories to really understand, so what were all these things that got them embroiled in this. There's another story I'd like to share, mainly because it really goes to the transformational aspects of the story that I'd like people to see, and certainly the role that it's played in my life in trying to figure out how to connect what I know about history through this story to practically speaking, what I do in the future, and what do I do with this story in my life, and how does it affect me, and how does it guide me? When I was tracking down people in occupied Poland, or actually it wasn't occupied when I went there, but in Poland, people who had worked on my grandfather's estates as slave labor. There was one man who I met. He was in his 80s, and his wife and his daughter were there with him to receive me, who I had a very important meeting with that really transformed this old dark story into something else for me. And he invited me into his house. He knew who I was, and he certainly knew who my grandfather was. And I listened to him for about 4 hours, and he shared the most gut-wrenching of stories about what my grandfather had done to his father on a more or less daily basis, namely that he beat him to near unconsciousness, and that he deported one of his relatives, deported his uncle. And all the time when he was relating this story to me, I stared into his face and noted this long black or a long scar over his right eye, and and as he was talking, I I didn't ask him, but he related a story so that I realized that this scar over his right eye was a consequence of a blow that my grandfather had delivered to his head with a club or something else when he was a 10-year-old boy and hadn't doffed his hat when my grandfather had passed him. So if you were a Polish male, you were supposed to doff your hat as the SS passed by. And of course, as I worked this out, I felt absolutely dreadful, and the tears were on my eyelids, but I held them back because I realized that this guy had gone through much, much worse than I had ever experienced. And when we got up at the end of our meeting, he could see the shame all over me about this, and he grabbed my lower arms and he shook me a bit, and he looked into my eyes and he said, "This wasn't your fault, and you didn't do anything. Now go out into my garden and experience the beauty out there." And I can safely say that in that moment, that man freed me from the shame that I felt and allowed me to embrace a sense of responsibility, and really gave me the energy that I needed to go on with the many years of research that still lay ahead, because I think otherwise I would have just given up. I just simply wouldn't have had the energy resources to do it. And so the reason I relate this story is because I do think that in our societies, shame, whether it has to do with slavery or the Holocaust, shame can be a block, and most often is the block to our facing history squarely and truthfully, and to being able to transform what we know into a sense of responsibility, where we can move forward and make a better society. So that really, for me, is the core of what I am trying to do in this book.
Yeah, and I'd like to ask one more question to tie this in, and that is the lesson of this research, because as we've discussed, it's easy to write people off. It's easy to just say, "Oh, I would never be a Nazi. I would be part of the resistance." As if Nazis back then were like Nazis in America today, which are total fringe losers. And you can argue their influence, but they're definitely not Third Reich levels. So it's hard to resist an enormous movement like that. And we have to realize that. And people died. There are many people who died as a result of their activities of trying to smuggle Jews and Romani, other marginalized peoples. In your research, how would you say we could learn the lessons from the past, have a nuanced understanding, but then also shift course, as you hope this research could do with your family, and not fall into old patterns?
Yeah, well, that's, of course, the question. I think that, I'd like to go back to I think you were talking earlier on when we started our conversation about the idea of American exceptionalism, or the kind of idea of people who were victors and people who were losers, and so on, and the victors having the moral right and all that. For me, it's been, I was given one impression of what my family had been engaged in Poland during the war, which was that they made Poland a better place, and they were, they had beautiful times, and they did all sorts of good things for Poles and improved the place. And, I think that sitting there and spending some time with your own family's past and trying to understand it more truthfully can be quite an important thing if more people did it in our society, because it's not so that I hope that most people don't have to make the discovery I did, but I think what you end up doing, just as when you do a sort of genealogical exercise, is that you find all kinds of people, all sorts, people impacted by all sorts of things happening, that are in your family, that are close to you, and actually that have influenced you. I have to admit that I have, of course, been influenced mainly by my grandmother, who I knew very well. And it's in that process that you end up being able to ask a lot of questions about the choices that you make and